Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Saturday edition of the Daily Fantasy Cafe podcast, Cafe on Air. I am your host, as always, Big Italy 42. We give you a little rundown of today's slate. We got a nice 8-game slate of action here in the NBA tonight, and I'm going to cover a little bit of FanDuel and DraftKings here, a little bit of comparison between some salaries of the two sites, some guys that make better plays, one place or the other. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I'm going to go position by position here. Starting off at point guard, which surprisingly is pretty thin tonight. You've got your top option, John Wall. He's $8,700 on DraftKings, $9,100 on FanDuel. The matchup's fine, but he's going to be playing down in pace a little bit. I think he makes for a better play on DraftKings, obviously with the lower price tag. But I don't think he's a must-play in a game against Milwaukee with a lower total, just 188 points, 4.5-point favorite for Milwaukee. So there's someone else from that game I'm going to be targeting a little bit more on the Washington end, so a little bit more on that later. I think he's a fine play, not a must play. Do you like Damian Lillard? Had some really strange stat lines recently. He had a 5.18 rebound game a couple games back. He's been struggling with his shot quite a bit. But if you look at his price here, pretty fair, $8,000 on DraftKings. And if you look over on FanDuel, his price is at $8,400. So once again, a little bit of a discount there on DraftKings. I think he's a fine play against Minnesota and Ricky Rubio, who not known as a good defensive team. In fact, one of the worst in the entire league. So I think he's in play as well. His counterpart there, Ricky Rubio, obviously in play. If you've been watching this show, you know he's one of my favorite players to target, one of my favorite players to watch even. And at $7,900 on DraftKings, he's a fair price, $8,100 on FanDuel. Pretty similar. I like him both places. There's not a lot of great options at point guard, so I'm definitely going to be targeting him in this one. And it's supposed to be a close game, 4.5-point spread. Minnesota is the underdog here, 199.5-point total, which seems pretty low, but it's the fourth highest actually on the night. So not a bad place to target. You're looking at guys like Kyrie Irving. It's a fast-paced game. You got a $7,500 price tag. I just don't like investing too much in expensive options for the Cavs outside of LeBron James. So Irving is a tournament play for me. I think he's a fine play in this fast-paced game. I mean, you've got a huge total in this one, 212 points, nearly the highest on the night, right behind Houston and Denver. But Cleveland, 11-point favorite. I'm not investing too much in Kyrie Irving. I think he's a fine tournament play, though. Tyreek Evans, for me, no thanks. Not a good matchup. He hasn't shown a whole lot of ceiling. Got a solid floor. I guess if you want to roll him out in a cash game, he's $7,200 on DraftKings. And $8,300 on FanDuel is way too much for me. So DraftKings target only there. I think Ty Lawson is an interesting tournament play at $7,000 on DraftKings and $7,500 on FanDuel. Not a guy I'll be investing in too heavily. We've seen some really, really strange things out of Ty Lawson recently. Really struggling with his shot. 2 games ago, he shot 0 for 9 against Minnesota in a great matchup, but did have 9 assists and 7 boards. Then last night against the Spurs, 7 for 13 from the field, 23-9. So he's got some upside. You don't love the matchup, but as you're looking at these games, though, the highest total on the night, you want the guys with the ball in their hands here. So I think he's certainly in play. Definitely not a cash game play for me tonight, though. Looking down a little bit lower, Goran Dragic did leave yesterday's game with a back injury. A little bit concerning. He did say his back locked up, and he had been struggling with that over the past few games. So if he is good to go, I love him in this spot at home against Sacramento, who struggled against point guards all season long, regardless of who's out there. So keep an eye on his status. If he's unable to go, I think that Tyler Johnson's an okay punt for a GPP. Not a guy I would be playing in my cash games, though, necessarily. Minimum price on DK, 3.7 on FanDuel. I think he is an okay option there, but only if Goran Dragic sits. We've got Luol Deng questionable. Again, obviously Chris Bosh out still for the season, and Dwayne Wade listed as probable for this one. So you're expecting that he'll be back, but someone's going to need to help out with the scoring there. And Tyler Johnson's got a decent amount of upside at that price, so I don't think you could do too badly there. A really interesting play that I've been noticing recently, Dennis Schroeder, $4,500 on DraftKings, $5K on FanDuel. You look at his recent logs, 35, 27, and 24 minutes, but 39.5, 33.5, and 29.5 fantasy points on DraftKings. Taking a lot of shots, at least 12 in each of the last 3 games. He's learned to coexist there with Jeff Teague. They're both have a decent amount of value, and he's significantly cheaper. So I think he's a fine play tonight, especially against Philly in a game that's supposed to be a blowout. Vegas has it pegged at a 10-point spread for Atlanta. Maybe Philly keeps it close, but I don't think either way it affects Schroeder too much. If the game gets out of hand, maybe Schroeder gets a little bit extra run, maybe in the low 30s. So I think he makes for a great play tonight at a cheap price. And if you're looking anywhere else at point guard, George Hill is in a fine spot, 6.4 on FanDuel, 6.5 on DraftKings, but not a guy I'm investing in too heavily against the Knicks. Obviously, the matchup's there, but Indiana favored by 10 in this one, just 189.5 point total. It's a low-paced game, and who knows if New York can even keep it close because they have just been abysmal recently. So not investing too heavily. I don't think he's a consideration for cash games only because there's not a lot of options, but I think I'll go a different route. Moving over to shooting guard, Spencer and I talked about it yesterday on the show. You got to go with your opportunity cost. It's very important in DFS. And tonight, despite an 8-game slate, there is one elite option and then a significant drop-off. So you have James Harden, who, if you didn't have him last night, we're mentioning what you're giving up by fading a guy like James Harden. 75 fantasy points on DraftKings last night. And obviously, DraftKings, you only have to play one shooting guard. You have to play 2 on FanDuel. Either way, if you didn't have James Harden last night, you weren't winning any significant money. So, obviously, Victor Oladipo was a solid pivot last night. And those that played both of them obviously did quite well. But I don't love a lot of the other options here today. You've got Dwayne Wade listed as probable. He's got a great price on DraftKings, 7.2K. Sitting out last night. Was said it was because of a sore hip. I'm pretty sure he was just resting because he's getting up there in years, getting him ready for tonight's game. And Sacramento giving up the most points to shooting guards this season. So Wade could be in line for a really nice night. 7.6 on FanDuel is a fine price as well. So I think he's option B there with Eric Bledsoe still being pretty priced out. 8.9 on FanDuel, 8.1 on DK. Probably throw him in some tournaments on DK, but I'm not going too crazy with Bledsoe. I mean, he's 7 turnovers each of his last 2 games. He's hit 40 fantasy points in each of those 2 games on DraftKings, but not much upside past that. So I think he's an okay play. I won't be playing him on FanDuel at 8,900. And looking down a little bit further, if you're looking on FanDuel, Giannis Antetokounmpo, 6.4K, I think is a fine play. He's 6.9 at small forward on DraftKings. A little bit too much for me there. J.R. Smith is a guy I like quite a bit tonight. You're looking at his price on DraftKings, 5.5K, and on FanDuel, he's sitting at 5.7. He's a guy that excels in a fast-paced game. He's a jump shooter. He can distribute the ball in a decent amount, and he doesn't turn the ball over. 0 turnovers in his last 2 games total in 67 minutes. So not a guy that'll kill you. Obviously, these aren't efficiency sites, so if he shoots 5 for 16, it's really not going to hurt you, and you've got to like his matchup there against Phoenix in his fast-paced game. Also a pretty safe play even if this one gets out of hand. So that's my main target for the Cleveland Cavaliers tonight in that big total. That's the way I'm going. If you're looking down a little bit further, you've got Rodney Stuckey, 5.8 on DK, 5.3 on FanDuel. Kind of a strange line last time out against the Knicks 2 days ago. He only played 19 minutes, but he did have 24 fantasy points on DraftKings. So a guy that I'm considering for tournaments, not really cash game playable because it's a blowout risk, and I kind of thought he would get some extra run in that game. I haven't really seen why he didn't. Maybe it was just a rest thing. So I think he's a great tournament option. Not a guy I'm going to be putting in all my cash games. Did hear that Bradley Beal may end up sitting out tonight. So monitor your lineups there. See what's going on with him before you slot him in. But he's got a fair price at $5,900 on DraftKings. But not a guy that I'll be investing in even if he does go outside of maybe one tournament. The guy that's going to be a cash game staple for me due to the unfortunate injury to Wesley Matthews, who's now out for the season. Aaron Aflalo, not a ton of upside, but at 4.1 on DraftKings and 4.5 on FanDuel, especially FanDuel where you have to play 2 small forwards. I think he's your de facto play there for cash games. He's cheap. Like I said, not a lot of upside, 15.5 and 12.75 fantasy points last 2 games, but a great matchup against Minnesota, who doesn't defend any position particularly well. And I'm hoping he can pull 15 to 20 fantasy points. I think that's a realistic floor for him. So he should be able to pay off his price tag and fill in at a weak position there at shooting guard. Next up, small forward. You got your obvious top play. LeBron James. I have no idea who Phoenix thinks is going to cover him. Obviously, PJ Tucker, an above-average defender. But not a great defender against LeBron James, but who really is. So not a guy that I'll be investing a ton in, but you obviously want to have yourself some exposure in tournaments. He's really expensive though, 11.2K on DraftKings, or I'm sorry, on FanDuel, and 10.5 on FanDuel. So he's a guy you're going to want some exposure to in tournaments, but not going crazy, not putting in my cash games. The guy I am playing in my cash games here is Rudy Gay. Going up against Miami, who Luol Deng, like I said, listed questionable. Obviously not as good of a matchup if Luol Deng does go, but Rudy Gay has just been getting it done. Last night, an enormous game. As anyone knows, if you played Rudy Gay last night, you probably had a pretty good night. 62.5 fantasy points on DraftKings. So took 26 shots against Orlando. Obviously a much better matchup there. They're the worst in the league against small forwards. But Rudy Gay, 7,200 DraftKings, 74 on FanDuel, is an elite option. I think he's the obvious 1B option behind LeBron James. And if you're talking dollar for dollar, I think he makes for the best play at the position. I don't think it's particularly close. Moving down, you could look at Andrew Wiggins, 6.8, DraftKings 6.7, FanDuel. Not a guy I'll be investing in much, despite the decent matchup. Point total just under 200. I don't like him against Nick Batum, though, particularly, so that'll be a pass for me. But Batum is a guy I'm definitely looking at. 48 and 42 fantasy points over his last two. Playing big minutes, he's going to be asked to do a little bit more in the offense now with Wesley Matthews out. That's a big chunk of the offense missing, so Batum, a guy I like quite a bit. 6,200 on both the big sites here, and I think he will be a cash game staple for not only myself, but quite a few others as well. Danilo Gallinari, yet another guy who has just been a perfect cash game play. I mean, 5.7 on DraftKings, 5.3 on FanDuel. He's got a fair price, and looking at his logs here, you've got 6 of his last 7 games over 25 fantasy points. The one that wasn't was at 21. He's getting big minutes, over 30 minutes a game. I think he's a nice safe play. Not a ton of upside, but this is the biggest total on the night, so I think he's a solid play. He could definitely hit you 30 fantasy points. Pair him with Nick Batum there at small forward if you want to go cheap, or put him in there with Rudy Gay. I'll be going one of those routes tonight. And if you want a really cheap cash game play, I don't mind Jeff Green. He's 4,800 on DraftKings, 46 on FanDuel. The guy doesn't have a ton of upside, but he is playing big minutes, over 30 in 4 straight, over 22 fantasy points each of those games. So if you just need a filler, everything else in your lineup fills out well. You land on Jeff Green. I think he's a fine cash game play. Not much upside for a tournament, though, for me. Moving on now to power forward. We've got your obvious top option here. Again, seems to be the theme at every position tonight except for point guard. Anthony Davis, not a great matchup, of course. 10,800 though, but as we know, doesn't really matter with Anthony Davis. He's going to get it done when he gets it done, and finally seeing some consistency, seeing him be a huge part of the offense like we all hoped he would be all season. Last 2 games, 81 and 57 fantasy points, averaging 34 points, 13.5 rebounds, and 5.5 blocks since his return from injury. So absolutely an elite option there. And yes, Memphis is a good defensive team, but Anthony Davis is unguardable. So if you can afford him, get him in your lineups. LaMarcus Aldridge also in a great spot, 9,200 on DraftKings, 96 on FanDuel. I don't think he's necessary. I'll talk about some more guys here in a minute. I think you could slot in easier. An elite option here on DraftKings is Zach Randolph once again. Not a great matchup, but 7,400 is a great price for him tonight on DraftKings. I won't be looking into him much on FanDuel at 8,300. Still a little bit pricey for me there. Moving down a little bit further, you got Terrence Jones, who's playing very well. Now gets the dream matchup against a terrible front court in Denver. We saw the Spurs shred them for 120 points last night. You expect Houston's going to put up some big numbers on them as well. You can get him at 6,700 on FanDuel. One of the best plays on the night in my book. Not quite a must play, but damn near a must play for me. So 7,000 on DraftKings, a fine price point as well. And go down a little bit further from him, you've got Kenneth Faried going up against Houston. Not an ideal matchup, but once again, fast-paced. Last night wasn't a good matchup for Faried either, and he just got it done once again. So especially on DraftKings where you've got that double-double bonus, he's coming off 3 straight double-doubles. And, you know, matchup against Houston tonight, 212.5 point total. I want as much exposure as possible, and I think Fareed at 6,100. The Manimal on both FanDuel and DraftKings is certainly in play for me. Going down a little bit further, you've got Andrea Bargnani, who burst onto the scene, disappeared for a game, and then looks like he came back. Last game he played against this same Indiana team in Indiana. 25 points, 4 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 blocks, and a steal. 41 DraftKings fantasy points. At 5K, I think he's a fine play tonight. Don't know that I'll be slotting him in my cash game. Still a lot of risk there with him. And on an 8-game slate, I think there are better options. But I would be getting yourself some exposure if you're playing tournaments. He's pretty cheap, 5K on both sites. So I think definitely look at him if you're looking to go cheap there. And Ersan Ilyasova getting big minutes off the bench. You look at his last few games, and while still not starting, I mean, he's got 30, 34, 30, and 35 minutes the last 3 games. 3 of his last 4 games over 31 fantasy points on DraftKings. Just 4.7K on DraftKings, 4.5 on FanDuel. So I would prefer him over Andrea Bargnani if you're looking for a cheap cash game play. Neither in a great spot tonight, but both pretty cheap. I think Ilyasova with the higher floor. Obviously, Bargnani with the higher ceiling. So that's where I'm going there. If you move over to center, there are some good options. Of course, DeMarcus Cousins always in play. Still really, really cheap on DraftKings at just 9,600. So if you're playing on DraftKings, get yourself some DeMarcus Cousins exposure, despite seemingly tough matchup against Hassan Whiteside. 10.6 on FanDuel might be a little bit much for me because there's some other options I like better. You've got Marcus All, 7,600. DraftKings, 77 on FanDuel. He's a great cash game play as usual. Moving down a little bit further, Marcin Gortat, 6,100 on DraftKings and 6,300 on FanDuel. The guy has just been on fire recently. His last 4 games, 8-14, 16-17, 12-12, and 14-17. I was not on him last night. I kind of thought he was more of a tournament play and a tough matchup with Hassan Whiteside, but dominated the glass once again. Now getting one of the best matchups a center could ask for against a terrible Milwaukee interior defense. So Gortat, kind of the go-to cash game play for me tonight at center. Looking down a little bit further, Alex Len obviously sprained his ankle last night, missed the last 8 minutes of the game. So monitor his situation. If he plays, I think he's an okay play for tournaments. I won't be investing in him. I probably will have 0 shares, even if he does suit up. Just too risky for me right now at that price tag. At 5,500, it seems fine. But if he's not 100%, I'm not going to be rostering him tonight, especially if the Cavs end up going small and he doesn't see as many minutes. So no thanks for me there. Moving down a little bit further, and this guy makes a great, great play on DraftKings. Robin Lopez, $4,000 against Minnesota, down low. Everyone knows about their deficiencies. I've already mentioned it a couple times in this podcast alone. His last 3 games, 26, 23, and 30 fantasy points. And it's a much, much tougher matchups in this. Sacramento going up against DeMarcus Cousins. The Clippers going up against DeAndre Jordan. And Dallas going against Tyson Chandler. Now he gets Minnesota. Much worse down low than any of these guys. I absolutely love Robin Lopez at $4,000 tonight on DraftKings. And he's even play for me at 5.2 on FanDuel, although I'll likely prefer going with Gortat, just about $1,000 more. But if that savings helps you get a significant upgrade elsewhere, I don't blame you there. Go ahead and roll out Rolo instead down low. And that's going to go ahead and wrap it up here today for your Saturday edition. We've got a nice slate of action tonight. Great options at every position. It looks to me like point guard's going to be a huge deciding factor in what goes on tonight. So definitely check out some content that we have at dailyfantasycafe.com. We've got some great NBA content. We've got some MLB content, some season long. We've got some daily content coming out for that very soon as well. So thank you for hanging out with me here today, and I will see you guys again on Monday.